The first thing I remember is the taste of blood and the sound of something enormous burning above me. I was upside down. The harness had locked across my chest during the impact, and now I hung from it like a dead thing, swinging gently as the escape pod settled deeper into whatever canopy had caught it. Through the cracked viewport beneath my dangling head, I could see bioluminescent fungus pulsing in slow green waves across the jungle floor 20 feet below. Beautiful, completely useless information for a princess who was about to die. I reached for the harness release with my upper right arm, and the pain hit so hard that my vision whited out. I came back to myself screaming through clenched teeth. Compound fracture. I could feel the bone ends grinding when I tried to move. My lower right arm was worse. It hung at an angle that arms are not designed to hang at, swollen and darkening beneath the skin. 2 of my forearms gone, just like that. I used my left arms to release the harness and dropped badly, landing on the crumpled interior wall of the pod. Something sharp opened a gash along my hip. More blood. I was running out of blood to lose. Through the shattered hull above me, I could see the sky, and in that sky, my ship was dying. The crescent of dawning had been the fastest diplomatic courier in the Zarathi fleet, and now it was a spreading flower of fire across the upper atmosphere, raining debris in long bright streaks that carved through the clouds. My escort carriers were already gone. I had watched them come apart in the first 90 seconds of the ambush. 3 ships and 400 crew dissolved into expanding clouds of gas and metal, while I ran for the escape pods. My security detail had made it into the pod with me. 4 of them. They were all dead now, killed by the impact or the deceleration, or the shrapnel that had turned the interior into a blender of broken metal. The ambush had come from nowhere. One moment we were cruising through the Velathos corridor on the way to a minor trade summit, and the next moment, an unmarked warfleet dropped out of fold space so close that their gravity wake nearly tore us apart before the first shot was fired. 8 ships. Military-grade weapons on civilian hulls. Someone had spent a fortune making this look like a pirate raid, and someone had spent another fortune making sure we would be in exactly this corridor at exactly this time. I knew what that meant. This was not random. This was paid for. Someone inside the Empire wanted me dead. But that was a problem for later, because right now something was moving through the jungle below me, and it was not wildlife. I heard voices. Low, clicking, guttural. Kolari. My stomach dropped so hard I thought I might be sick. The Kolari were 7-foot reptilian mercenaries who operated on a simple professional principle. They completed the contract, and the contract always included the same final clause. No witnesses, no survivors, no evidence. They were the galaxy's most reliable killers, precisely because they never left anyone alive to complain about their methods. I counted voices. 4, 6, 8, at least 8 of them down there, spreading through the undergrowth in a search pattern, and they were heading toward the crash trail my pod had carved through the canopy. I had no weapons. My biobeacon was destroyed. My communicator was crushed somewhere under the body of Lieutenant Dressa, whose dead eyes stared at nothing from beneath a collapsed support beam. No one was coming for me, because no one knew I was alive. My mother, the Empress of 11 star systems, the most powerful woman in 3 sectors of charted space, had no idea her youngest daughter was bleeding in a broken pod on an uncharted fringe world with 8 Kolari killers closing in. I pulled myself through a crack in the hull and dropped into the canopy. The fall nearly killed me. Branches broke under my weight, and I slid and tumbled down through layers of alien vegetation, catching myself with my 2 good arms, biting through my lip to keep from screaming every time the motion jarred my broken bones. I hit the ground hard, rolled, and lay still in the phosphorescent moss, breathing in shallow gasps and listening. The Kolari were close. I could hear their equipment clicking. They had thermal scanners. My blood was hot, and my body was radiating heat from the pain response. And I was leaving a trail of actual blood on every surface I touched. I had maybe 20 minutes before they found me, and maybe 30 before I bled out, and I was not sure which would be worse. I started crawling. Not away from the Kolari, because there was no away. They had me surrounded in a tightening search grid, and they were professionals, and I was a diplomat who had never been in a real fight in her life. I crawled toward the only thing my failing mind could fix on, the sound of engines. It was faint at first, lost beneath the clicking of Kolari comms, and the distant roar of my ship's wreckage, entering the atmosphere in its final death spiral. But it was there, a ship, not a Kolari ship, because their ships were silent, built for stealth and murder. This was something old and loud and mechanical, something that coughed and sputtered as it descended, and it was landing in a clearing less than a kilometer to the north. I dragged myself through the undergrowth toward that sound, with both broken arms cradled against my chest, and my blood painting the moss behind me. I did not go toward it because I expected help. I had been trained since birth in the mathematics of power, and the mathematics of power said clearly that no rational being helps a stranger when the cost of helping is death. I went toward it because the hull of a ship, any ship, would stop Kolari pulse rounds long enough for me to find a transmitter and send a signal. I went toward it because I was out of options and dying and afraid, and the sound of those sputtering engines was the only thing in the darkness that was not trying to kill me. The clearing opened ahead of me like a wound in the jungle canopy. The ship sitting in it was one of the ugliest things I had ever seen. It was a human freighter, a boxy, graceless thing, with carbon scoring along the nacelles and hull patches that did not match the original plating. The name was stenciled on the side in human script that I could barely read through my swelling eyes. Orchard Wren. It looked like it had been built from spare parts and held together by stubbornness. The landing ramp was down, and a human was standing at the base of it, running some kind of diagnostic tool along a coolant line that was visibly leaking. He was average height for his species, brown hair cut short, a cargo jacket with patches on the elbows. He was humming to himself, some tuneless human melody, and he had a small pistol holstered on his hip that looked like it had never been fired. I reached the tree line and collapsed. He saw me. I do not know what I looked like from his perspective. A four-armed alien woman covered in blood, two arms bent at wrong angles, skin that normally shimmered in shades of deep blue now gone gray with shock. Bioluminescent markings along my temples flickering erratically, the way they do when a Zerithi is close to death. I must have looked like something from a nightmare. He did not hesitate. He did not scan me for weapons or check for identification, or calculate the political implications of intervening in an obvious imperial emergency. He crossed the clearing at a run, dropped to his knees beside me, and said one word, "Hey." I tried to explain. I tried to tell him who I was, what was chasing me, what it would cost him to be involved. The words came out broken and wet with blood. He was not listening anyway. He was checking my injuries with hands that moved fast and careful, the way someone moves when they know exactly how much trouble a person is in and have decided that the trouble is now theirs to share. He picked me up. He was not a large man, and I am not a small woman by Zerithi standards, and he lifted me off the ground as though I weighed nothing and carried me up the ramp and into his ship. He set me down on a bench in the cargo bay, said, "Stay here," and went for the cockpit. I heard the ramp seal. I heard the engine cycle up, and then I heard the Kolari burst from the tree line and open fire. Pulse rounds hammered the hull, the ship rocked and groaned, and the lights flickered. I heard the human swear, a short, sharp word, and then the orchard wren lurched off the ground with a violence that threw me off the bench. We were not flying. We were falling upward, engines screaming, the hull shrieking as branches and canopy vines ripped across it. And outside the small cargo bay viewport, I could see the muzzle flashes of 8 Kolari soldiers firing everything they had at a ship that was already moving too fast for them to track. We cleared the canopy. The human was flying like a man who had never been trained for combat, because he had never been trained for combat. He hauled frozen protein and machine parts along routes no one else wanted. He flew between relay stations that were too far apart and paid too little, and kept his ship running with electrical tape and second-hand components. He was not a soldier. He was not a hero. He was a working man in a beaten-up freighter, and he was flying that freighter through ground fire and atmospheric turbulence with his teeth clenched and his knuckles white on the controls, and an alien stranger bleeding on his cargo bay floor. 2 interceptors rose from behind the ridgeline. Kolari fast-attack ships, sleek and lethal, built for exactly this kind of pursuit. They locked on instantly. Warning tones filled the cockpit. The human did something I did not expect. He did not try to outrun them, because he could not outrun them. He did not try to outfight them, because he had no weapons worth mentioning. Instead, he hit the cargo bay release, and 40 tons of industrial coolant canisters blew out of the belly of the Orchard Wren in a spreading cloud of metal and frozen chemical. The interceptors hit the debris field at full speed. One veered hard to port, taking impacts across its forward shields. The other pulled up so sharply that it stalled and dropped 300 meters before recovering. The human used those 4 seconds to punch the fold drive. The drive was not ready. The charge cycle was barely at 60%, and a fold jump at 60% is the kind of thing that engineers write cautionary papers about. The Orchard Wren hit fold space like a stone hitting water, and the transition nearly ripped the ship in half. Every alarm on the ship went off at once. Panels blew out in showers of sparks. The hull groaned in a way that metal groans when it is being asked to do something metal cannot do. I was thrown across the cargo bay and landed on my broken arms, and the pain was so immense that the world went white and then black, and I was gone. I woke to silence. We were drifting somewhere in deep space, systems failing, hull creaking. The lights were on emergency red. I could hear the human somewhere forward, banging on something with a tool, and I could hear him breathing hard, the way someone breathes when they are hurt, but ignoring it, because there is work to do. I pulled myself upright and managed one question. My voice was a wreck. I barely recognized it as mine. "Why did you do that?" He appeared in the doorway between the cargo bay and the cockpit. There was blood on his forehead, where a ceiling panel had struck him during the jump. He was holding a wrench in one hand and a flashlight in the other, and he looked at me with an expression I could not read, an expression I had never seen on the face of any being in my entire life, in the courts and councils of the Zerithi Empire. He said, "You were hurt. What else was I supposed to do?" He said it the way someone says something obvious, the way someone says the sky is up or water is wet, as though the alternative, the rational, self-preserving alternative of leaving a bleeding stranger in a jungle while killers closed in, had genuinely never occurred to him as a possibility. I stared at him. In that moment, hanging in dead space in a crippled freighter, with 2 broken arms and a stranger's blood drying on a stranger's floor, I felt something I had never felt in 26 years of imperial education and diplomatic training and court politics. I felt completely and utterly out of my depth, not because of the danger, because of the kindness. I passed out again. When I woke the second time, my arms had been splinted. He had used cargo straps and packing foam, cut and shaped with a utility knife, padded with strips torn from what looked like his own spare shirt. The splints were not elegant, they were not medical, but they held my bones in place, and they did not hurt more than they had to, and the care in their construction was unmistakable. This man had sat beside an unconscious alien he had never met, and built splints from cargo supplies with the patience of someone who believed that doing a thing right mattered, even when no one was watching. He was sitting across from me when I opened my eyes, holding a cup of water, waiting. Just waiting. Like he had all the time in the universe, and the only important thing in it was making sure I drank when I woke up. I drank the water. It was lukewarm and tasted faintly of recycled minerals, the kind of water that comes from a ship filtration system that has been running too long without a proper service. It was the best water I had ever tasted in my life. The human told me his name was Callum Voss. He said it the way humans introduce themselves, with a small nod, as though offering his name was offering something real. I told him my name was Viella. I did not tell him my title. Not yet. I was still trying to understand him, and I knew from a lifetime of court training that titles change how people behave. I wanted to see who he was before he knew who I was. He told me the situation. The fold drive had burned out 2 of its 3 coil assemblies during the emergency jump. We had dropped out of fold space in an uncharted region. No relay stations in range. No navigation beacons within passive scan distance. The main communications array was dead. Life support was functioning but running on backup power, which gave us maybe 4 days of breathable air. He needed to repair the fold coils enough for 3 short jumps to reach the nearest populated system, a neutral transit hub called Maravan Station, that sat at the edge of Zerithi-controlled space. 3 jumps, each one requiring hours of repair work on a drive that had nearly torn itself apart. each one carrying the risk that the coils would fail again and scatter us across fold space as a cloud of disassociated atoms. I asked him if that was likely. He thought about it with the honest, unhurried consideration I was beginning to recognize as simply the way he processed the world. Then he said, probably not. But he had been wrong before. He said this with a small shrug, as though being wrong about something that could atomize him was a manageable inconvenience. I told him who I was. I told him my full name and title. Princess Viaella, of the Zarithi Empire, youngest daughter of Sovereign Empress Ithera, blood heir to the throne of reflected light, diplomatic envoy of the imperial court. I told him that the Empress would reward him beyond anything his cargo runs could earn in 10 lifetimes. I told him he had saved someone whose gratitude could reshape his entire existence. I expected his demeanor to change. I had seen it happen 1,000 times at court. The moment someone realizes they are in the presence of power, something shifts behind their eyes. Greed, or calculation, or the careful performance of deference that is really just another form of greed. Every species I had ever encountered did this. The Vorathi would have immediately begun negotiating territorial concessions. The Kolari would have started calculating my ransom value. The Solani would have smiled and begun constructing a century-long web of diplomatic obligation. Power changes how people look at you. It always has. It always will. Callum looked uncomfortable. He shifted on his seat and rubbed the back of his neck with one hand and said, "I don't need a reward. I just need to know where to take you." I did not believe him. I want to be honest about that. I did not believe him because I had never met a person who meant those words. In the Zarithi court, every act of generosity is a move in a game so complex and ancient that it takes decades of study to understand its basic structure. My mother once told me that the difference between an ally and an enemy is simply the direction from which the blade approaches. I was raised in a world where kindness is currency, and currency is never free. So I watched him. During the hours he spent working on the first coil repair, I watched from the cockpit doorway as he lay on his back inside the engine housing, covered in coolant fluid and carbon dust, replacing components with parts scavenged from other systems on the ship. He talked to himself while he worked. Not to me. To himself. Little muttered commentary on the state of the connections. Occasional quiet profanity when something did not fit. A running monologue that was clearly the habit of a man who spent most of his time alone. He hummed that same tuneless melody. He stopped twice to make sure I had enough water. I tested him. It was instinct, court training so deep it operated below conscious thought. I implied, carefully and subtly, that my mother might view the rescue as a kidnapping if he could not prove his intentions. I suggested that the Empress had been known to destroy ships that were found carrying members of the imperial family without authorization. I watched his face for the reaction. Fear, leverage-seeking, any shift toward the transactional framework I understood. He went pale. Genuinely pale. Then he said, if that was a risk, he would drop me at the nearest station and leave before anyone could connect him to me. He would rather I was safe and he was in trouble than the other way around. I sat with that for a long time. The first full jump worked. The coils held, barely, and we dropped out in a region of empty space that was at least closer to the shipping lanes. Callum immediately began working on the second coil repair. I offered to help. He showed me what to hold and what to pass him, and how to read the diagnostic panel so I could tell him when the charge levels were stabilizing. We worked together in the cramped engine housing, my two good arms handing him tools while he lay contorted inside the coil assembly, and I learned things about him simply by being near him. He was 34 years old. He had been a cargo hauler for 11 years, running independent routes along the outer trade lanes, where the contracts paid poorly, and the distances were long, and the company was mostly yourself. He had been married once. It had ended. He did not say why, and I did not ask, and the way he did not say why told me it still hurt. He had a daughter. Her name was Maisie, and she was 7, and he called her every time he was in range of a communications relay, which was not often enough, which was never often enough. He carried a drawing she had made tucked into the visor above the pilot's seat. It was a picture of a spaceship that looked nothing like any spaceship, and it was clearly the most important object on the Orchard Wren. He had moderate debt on the ship, He liked bad music and coffee that was too sweet. He read old human novels on his datapad during long hauls, the kind with detectives and rainy cities. He was not remarkable by human standards. He was nobody. He was absolutely nobody, and nobody had risked his life and his ship and his livelihood to carry a bleeding stranger out of the dark. During a rest period between repairs, I asked him what humans called this quality, this thing he had done, this willingness to sacrifice for a stranger without expectation of return. I asked if there was a word for it, a concept, a philosophy. He shrugged and said he did not think it had a special name. Where he came from, it was just called being decent. I explained to him that in Zirithi High Court, every act of apparent generosity was a calculated move, that favors were investments, and rescues were leverage, and kindness was a weapon wielded with precision over timescales that spanned generations. I told him that the game was so intricate and so beautiful in its cruelty that I had spent my entire life learning its rules and still understood only a fraction of its depth. He listened. Then he said, "That sounds exhausting." I almost laughed. I almost laughed in a crippled freighter drifting through empty space with 2 broken arms, and mercenaries somewhere behind us, and the most powerful woman in 3-star sectors not knowing if her daughter was alive, because a cargo hauler who ate bad food and listened to worse music had just summarized 4,000 years of Zirithi political philosophy in 3 words. The second fold jump failed. We dropped out of fold space inside a debris belt, the remains of some ancient battle that had scattered wreckage across 1 billion kilometers of orbital space. Fragments of ships that had been old before the Zirithi Empire existed, turned slowly in the starlight, pitted and scarred and long dead. The third coil had cracked during the jump. Callum needed to go outside the ship to realign it manually, which meant working in vacuum, which meant putting on the one remaining environment suit aboard the Orchard Wren. The suit was rated for light maintenance, not extended exterior repair. Its oxygen supply was designed for 90 minutes. The repair would take longer than that. He did not tell me how long it would take. He just put on the suit, checked the seals, picked up his tools, and went out the airlock. I monitored him from the cockpit, where his suit telemetry fed to the main display. I could see everything. Heart rate elevated. Oxygen consumption higher than optimal, because the suit's recycler was old and losing efficiency. Core temperature dropping steadily, because the suit's thermal system was designed for short exposure, and space is very, very cold. He worked for 11 hours. 11 hours in a failing suit in the vacuum of space. Hands shaking from cold, fingers going numb inside gloves that were losing pressure in the left index, and right ring seals. Breathing air that was growing thin and stale. I watched his heart rate climb, and his oxygen drop, and his temperature fall. And I told him through the comm to come inside, to rest, to let me try something else. And he said no. He said the coil was almost aligned. He said he was fine. He was not fine. His voice was slurred from cold, and his breathing was ragged, and I could see on the telemetry that he was approaching the edge of what a human body could sustain. He did not come back inside until the coil was aligned. He would not leave a job half done when someone was counting on him. When the airlock cycled and he stumbled back into the ship, he collapsed against the wall and sat there for 10 minutes, shivering so violently that I could hear his teeth chattering from across the compartment. I brought him a thermal blanket and the terrible sweet coffee he liked, made from the ship's dispenser, and I wrapped the blanket around him with my 2 good arms and held the cup while he drank because his hands were shaking too badly to hold it himself. He looked up at me and said thank you, as though I was the one doing something remarkable, as though holding a cup of coffee for the man who had just spent 11 hours in vacuum to save my life was an act of extraordinary generosity. I understood something then, that none of my tutors had ever taught me, that no diplomatic briefing had ever contained, that no intelligence report had ever captured. There exists a species in this galaxy that does not treat compassion as currency. Humans do not rescue you and then present the invoice. They do not calculate the return on investment of pulling a stranger out of the dark. They do it because something in their biology or their culture or their strange, violent, contradictory hearts simply will not let them walk away from someone who is in pain. It is not a strategy. It is not a tactic. It is not even a choice, not really, not in the way the Zirithi understand choice. It is something deeper, something structural, something built into the architecture of what they are. The third jump worked. The orchard wren limped into sensor range of Maravan Transit Hub, a massive neutral station that sat at the boundary of Zarithi-controlled space, like a doorstep between empires. I used the station's secure communication terminal to send a priority black signal, the highest emergency classification available to a member of the Imperial bloodline, directly to my mother's personal intelligence network. Within 53 minutes, 3 Zarithi warships dropped out of fold space and surrounded the station. The Resolute Dawn, the Thorn of Silence, and the Cold Meridian, 3 capital-class warships, each one carrying enough firepower to slag a continent, and they arranged themselves around Maravan Station with the precise geometric menace that Zarithi military doctrine demanded. My mother had been looking for me for 4 days. 4 days of silence, 4 days of not knowing. I cannot imagine what those 4 days were like for the most powerful woman in the known galaxy, sitting on a throne that commanded fleets and armies, and the fate of civilizations, unable to find her youngest daughter. The ramp of the orchard wren lowered, and Callum found himself staring down the ceremonial weapons of 40 Imperial sentinels in full battle dress. They were enormous, armored, silent. Their weapons hummed with charged energy, and their eyes were fixed on him with the cold professional assessment of soldiers who had been trained to view every unknown as a threat, until proven otherwise. Callum stood very still. He did not raise his hands. He did not speak. He just stood there in his patched cargo jacket, with coolant stains on the sleeves and a healing cut on his forehead, looking at 40 armed soldiers who could erase him from existence with a thought, and he did not flinch. Not because he was brave, because he was tired, and he had done the right thing, and he was not ashamed of any of it. I pushed past the sentinels and grabbed his arm. "Stay beside me," I said. "I will not let them hurt you." He looked at me, and for the first time since I had met him, I saw something that was almost a smile. Small, exhausted, real. "Wasn't worried about me," he said. They took us aboard the Imperial dreadnought Silence Before Verdict, and they separated us immediately. Medical officers pulled me one direction, intelligence officers pulled Callum another, and within minutes, the man who had saved my life was behind a sealed door in a compartment I was not authorized to enter. I fought the medical officers, not physically. I was in no condition for that, with 2 broken arms and blood loss and the early stages of infection setting into the gash along my hip. But I fought them with words and rank, and the particular kind of fury that only a Zarithi princess can produce when she has been patronized by people who work for her mother. They wanted to sedate me. They wanted to set my bones and put me in a recovery pod and handle the human situation quietly, through proper channels, as though Callum Voss were a situation to be handled, rather than a person who deserved my protection. I demanded to know where they had taken him. The medical chief, a careful woman named Lorith who had served the Imperial family for 60 years, told me that Director Sorvael was conducting a standard security interview. She said this as though it were routine, as though the word interview meant the same thing aboard a Zarithi intelligence vessel as it meant in normal conversation. I knew what Sorvael's interviews looked like. I had studied them. Director Sorvael was my mother's chief of Imperial security, a man who had served the throne for longer than I had been alive, whose loyalty was absolute, and whose methods were the subject of whispered conversations among diplomats who had been on the receiving end. He did not use violence. He was far too sophisticated for that. He used pressure. Layered, systematic, relentless psychological pressure, designed to disassemble a person's story from the inside out, to find the cracks, the inconsistencies, the places where fiction failed to hold up under the weight of sustained interrogation. I pulled rank. I used my blood rank authority, the inherited weight of the Imperial bloodline, and I overrode the medical chief and the security protocols and the 6 officers who tried to explain to me that this was not how things were done. I had never pulled rank on anyone in my life. I had always found it distasteful, this idea that my blood entitled me to override the judgment of people who were better trained and more experienced than I was. But I did it now, because Callum Voss was behind that door, and he did not deserve what was happening to him. I arrived at the interrogation chamber and entered without announcing myself. The room was exactly what I expected, cold, bright. A single table, a single chair, 3 intelligence officers positioned in the triangular formation that Zarithi interrogation doctrine prescribed for maximum psychological coverage. Sorvale stood at the back, watching, his forearms folded across his chest, his expression carrying the calm patience of a man who had all the time in the world and intended to use it. Callum was sitting in the chair. He looked smaller in that room. The proportions were wrong, the ceiling too high, the table too wide, everything scaled for Zarithi bodies that were taller and broader than his. He was still wearing his cargo jacket. He had not been offered anything to eat or drink since they had taken him from the ship. His hands were on the table, palms down, fingers still, and he was looking at the officer across from him with an expression of patient confusion that I was beginning to understand was simply his face, when he could not comprehend why someone was making something complicated that was very simple. The officers were midway through their standard approach. They had been working on him for over an hour, layering implications, constructing a narrative in which the rescue was staged, in which Callum was a planted operative, inserted by a rival faction to gain access to the imperial family, in which his arrival on that planet at that precise moment was not coincidence but conspiracy. He kept saying the same thing. He landed to fix his engine. He saw someone hurt. He helped. The officers did not believe him. They could not believe him. The simplicity of his story was so alien to Zarithi thinking, so fundamentally incompatible with the way their minds processed cause and effect and motive, that they could not hear it as truth. In their world, every action had a purpose beyond its surface, and a man who risked his life for a stranger without reason was either lying or insane, and they had already decided he was not insane. I stepped forward and said, "This interview is over." Sorvale turned to me. His expression did not change, because Sorvale's expression never changed. He said, "Princess, you should be in medical care." I said, "And this man should be treated as my guest. He saved my life. He is not a conspirator, and you know it." Sorvale was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know what your testimony suggests. I do not yet know what the evidence supports. The Empress will require more than a princess's emotional conviction." The word emotional landed exactly as he intended it to. Dismissive, reducing my certainty to sentiment. I felt my bioluminescent markings flare along my temples, the involuntary Zarithi anger response, and I saw the officers note it the way they noted everything. I asked Sorvale what would happen if the court found Callum guilty of conspiracy. He paused. The pause itself was an answer, but he gave me the word anyway. Dissolution. Dissolution. The Zarithi do not execute criminals the way humans imagine execution. We unmake them. Molecular dissolution. Every cell separated from every other cell, the body reduced to its component elements, the mind extinguished, not by violence, but by a silence so complete that it is as though the person never existed. We do not even leave a body to mourn over. Callum did not know this word. He sat at the table and watched me argue with Sorvale, and did not understand that we were arguing about whether or not he would be allowed to continue existing. I spent the next day preparing him. We had 2 days aboard the Silence before verdict, before we reached the throne world, and I used every hour I could steal from the medical officers and the security briefings, and the constant political maneuvering that surrounded me like currents in deep water. I tried to teach him court etiquette, the 17 postures of supplication, the precise angles of eye contact that communicated different levels of deference, the ritual phrases that opened and closed formal address, the 1,000 small signals that the Zarithi court used to sort people into categories of worth. He tried. I want to emphasize this. He genuinely tried. He practiced the postures until his body ached from holding positions that were designed for beings with 4 arms. He repeated the phrases until his pronunciation was passable if not elegant. He listened to my explanations of court hierarchy with the focused attention of a man who understood that his life might depend on getting this right. But he kept defaulting to looking people in the eye when he spoke to them, because that was how humans communicated respect. In Zarithi culture, direct eye contact from an unranked individual was either a declaration of absolute authority or a challenge to combat, depending on the context, and the difference between the two was determined by subtle variations in posture that Callum could not reproduce because he had the wrong number of arms. Lady Cathara visited on the 2nd day. My elder sister, my mother's heir presumptive, the most politically sophisticated person I knew, outside of the Empress herself. She came to Callum's quarters with a small entourage, and spent an hour with him, while I was in a medical session, getting my arms properly set and regenerated. When I found out, I went to Cathara immediately. She was in her suite, and she received me with the cool elegance that was her signature. She told me she had been evaluating the human. I asked her what she had found. She said, "He is either the most brilliant operative I have ever encountered, or he is genuinely as simple as he appears." She paused, the way she always paused when she wanted you to understand that the next thing she said was the important part. "I am not certain which would be more dangerous." I asked what she had tried. She told me she had employed standard recruitment technique, offering him access, influence, information, the subtle promises that form the first threads of political alliance. She told me he had not recognized any of it. He had just talked to her, the way he talked to everyone, directly, without subtext, without guile. He had asked about her work and listened to her answers, and told her she seemed stressed, which was not something anyone had said to the heir presumptive of the Zarithi Empire in her entire adult life. Lord Protector Davrin, head of the military council, demanded that Callum be confined to a holding cell until the formal court session. He argued that the human's presence aboard an imperial vessel was a security violation that could not be mitigated by a princess's personal attachment. He used the word attachment deliberately, loading it with implication. I invoked the right of guest shield. The room went silent. Sorvale stopped mid-sentence. Cathara, who had been observing from a side corridor, stepped fully into view with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Davrin looked at me as though I had drawn a weapon. The right of guest shield was ancient, older than the current dynasty, older than most of the legal structures that governed the empire. It allowed a member of the imperial bloodline to grant personal protection to a foreign national by binding their fate to her own. If the guest was found guilty, the protector shared the sentence. If Callum was dissolved, I would be dissolved with him. I invoked it without hesitation. The words came out of me clear and steady and certain. Because I was clear and steady and certain. Not because I had calculated the odds, not because I had weighed the political implications, not because I believed I could manipulate the outcome, because he had carried me out of the dark, and I would not let him face this alone. The declaration was broadcast to the entire ship. 2,000 crew members heard the youngest princess of the Zarithi Empire stake her life on the innocence of a human cargo hauler. Callum was informed. He was brought to my quarters under guard, and Sorvale explained what I had done, and I watched the information land on him. I expected gratitude, or relief, or at least the recognition that his odds of survival had just improved significantly. He was angry. Not loud angry, not dramatic angry. The quiet, tight-jawed anger of a man who cannot believe that someone he cares about has done something reckless on his behalf. He looked at me with that anger burning steady behind his eyes and said, "You should not have done that." I said, "You would have done the same for me." He said, "That is different." I said, "Why?" He did not have an answer, and I told him that was exactly how I had felt on that jungle floor when he picked me up and carried me to his ship. He stood there in the doorway of my quarters, a cargo hauler in a borrowed coat, and the anger slowly left his face and was replaced by something I could not name. Something that was not gratitude and not affection and not obligation, but was perhaps some human thing that existed in the spaces between those words, something my language did not have a term for because my civilization had never needed one. The silence before verdict dropped out of fold space above Zarithia, and I stood with Callum at the forward observation deck and watched my homeworld rise in the viewport. I had seen it 1,000 times. I had never seen it through the eyes of a stranger. Zarithia was a world of crystal. The towers of the capital caught the light of the twin suns and broke it into spectra that painted the clouds. The floating court platforms drifted in the upper atmosphere like islands of cut glass. The throne of reflected light was visible from orbit, a structure carved from a single moon crystal, so vast that it cast a shadow you could see from space. Everything was beautiful. Everything was immense. Everything was designed to make anyone looking at it understand, immediately and viscerally, that they did not belong here unless the Empire said they did. I saw Callum take it in. This man who hauled frozen protein along trade lanes no one else wanted, who lived in a ship held together with patches and stubbornness, who ate bad food and drank sweet coffee and called his daughter from relay stations when he could afford the signal time. He looked at the seat of power for a civilization that spanned 11 star systems, and he said, "Your mom's place is nice." I laughed. I laughed so hard my broken arms ached in their regeneration casts, and it was the first real laugh I had produced since before the ambush. And the sound of it surprised me, because I had forgotten what it felt like. Not polite laughter, not court laughter, the kind that is calculated and deployed at precise moments for specific effect. Real laughter, the kind that comes from a place inside you that you forgot existed. I looked at Callum Voss, cargo hauler, debtor, father, nobody, and I realized that the laughter felt like something I had been missing for years without knowing it was gone. The court of the sovereign empress occupied the central chamber of the throne of reflected light, and it was designed to be overwhelming. I had grown up in this room. I had learned to walk on its crystal floor. I had spoken my first formal words of court address from the lowest ring, while my mother watched from the throne above, and my sister Cathara stood beside me and whispered the phrases I forgot. I knew every surface, every angle, every play of light across the vaulted ceiling, where the twin suns painted moving patterns that told the time of day more beautifully than any clock. I had never hated the room before. I hated it now. I hated it because I could see what it was going to do to Callum. 2,000 courtiers filled the concentric rings. Ambassadors from 9 species sat in their designated sections, each positioned according to the precise diplomatic geometry that governed seating arrangements. Military commanders in ceremonial armor, intelligence directors in their dark formal coats, trade ministers, judicial archons, cultural attachés, and the entire vast machinery of the Zarithi imperial government, all assembled in crystalline perfection around the central point of the chamber, where the throne of reflected light rose from the floor like a frozen explosion of captured starlight. My mother sat at its apex. I want to describe my mother to you, but I need you to understand that I am describing 2 people at once. There is my mother, who braided my hair when I was small and sang old songs in a language that predated the empire, and who once sat with me through an entire night when I was sick with seasonal fever, her hand on my forehead, her voice low and constant. And there is Sovereign Empress Aethera, who has ruled 11 star systems for longer than most species' recorded histories, who has negotiated treaties and prosecuted wars and ordered executions, and reshaped the political architecture of an entire galactic region with the cold precision of someone performing mathematics. They are the same person. They have always been the same person, and I have spent my entire life learning to navigate the distance between them. She sat on the throne, and she was not my mother. She was the Empress. Her bioluminescent markings burned in slow, steady patterns of deep violet, the color of absolute authority. Her forearms rested on the crystalline armrests in the posture of judgment, a configuration so old that its origins were lost in pre-imperial history. Her face was still. Her eyes were open and watching and showed nothing. They brought Callum in. He had refused the formal robes they offered him. He was wearing his cargo jacket, cleaned but still patched at the elbows, the same jacket he had been wearing when he carried me up the ramp of the orchard wren. Against the crystalline splendor of the court, surrounded by beings in ceremonial dress that cost more than his ship, he looked exactly like what he was. A working man, a hauler of frozen protein and machine parts, a person who had wandered into a world that was never built for him. Several courtiers made sounds of contempt, small sounds, carefully calibrated to express disdain without violating formal protocol. I heard them. I catalogued them. I would remember every one. Callum did not react to the sounds, not because he was ignoring them, because he genuinely did not notice. He was looking at the architecture with his mouth slightly open and his eyes wide, the unconcealed fascination of someone seeing something extraordinary for the first time. He looked up at the vaulted ceiling and the light patterns and the crystal formations that had taken 1,000 years to grow, and his face held the same wonder I imagined he had worn the first time he saw stars from orbit, the wonder of a man who had never learned to pretend that beautiful things were ordinary. The Empress spoke. Her voice filled the chamber through acoustics that had been engineered over centuries to carry the sovereign's words to every ear, without amplification, without distortion, with the weight of dynasties behind every syllable. "What do you want from us, human?" The chamber was silent. 2,000 people, and not one of them breathed audibly. Callum thought about it, not performing deliberation, not posturing, actually thinking, the way he thought about everything, with the unhurried consideration of a man who believed that honest answers deserved honest thought. The court waited. The Empress waited. 11 star systems waited for a cargo hauler to finish thinking. Then he said, "I would like to make sure she is safe and go home, if that is all right." The court did not know what to do with this. I could feel the confusion radiating through the chamber like heat. 2,000 trained political minds tried to parse his statement for subtext, for hidden demands, for the opening gambit of a negotiation strategy, and found nothing. It was exactly what it appeared to be: a man who wanted to know that the person he saved was safe and then wanted to go home. Surveil presented the intelligence assessment. He stood in the speaker's ring and delivered his findings with the methodical precision that made him the best intelligence officer in the Empire. The ambush was real, not staged. The Kolari mercenaries had been traced through 7 layers of financial obfuscation to a payment originating from within the Empire itself. The human's background check was comprehensive and unremarkable. Cargo manifests for 11 years, fuel receipts, maintenance logs, a custody agreement, an overdue library fine from a station he had visited 2 years ago. He was, conclusively and exhaustively, nobody. There was no connection to any faction, any intelligence service, any political entity. He was a man who hauled cargo and called his daughter and fixed his own ship. The Empress dismissed the report with a gesture that was barely a movement. She was not interested in the conspiracy. She had people for that. She was interested in the human. Then she did something I had never seen her do in a formal court session. Something that, according to the court archivists who would later verify the records, she had not done in living memory. She stood. And she descended from the throne of reflected light. She walked down the crystal steps that separated the sovereign from the court, each step ringing with a clear tone, like a bell being struck, and the sound of her footsteps in the silence was the loudest thing I had ever heard. She walked across the open floor of the central ring and stopped in front of Callum Voss. She was taller than him by a full head. She looked down at him with eyes that had negotiated the fates of worlds, that had stared down war fleets and trade embargoes, and assassination attempts, that had watched civilizations rise and crumble from the vantage point of a throne that had endured longer than most species' concept of forever. She asked him questions, and he answered them, and each answer was simpler than the one before. "You did not know who my daughter was when you saved her?" "No." "You had no alliance with our empire, no debt to repay, no contract to fulfill?" "No." "You risked your life and your vessel for a stranger of a species you had never encountered, with no expectation of recognition?" "That is right." "Why?" And he said what he had said on the ship, and what he had said in the jungle, and what he would apparently say until the stars burned out, because it was the only answer he had, and it was the truth. She was hurt. The Empress stared at him. The silence stretched. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Then my mother turned to me, and in the turning, something shifted. Something in her posture, something in the pattern of her bioluminescent markings, something so subtle that only someone who had studied her for 26 years would have seen it. She was still the Empress. She would always be the Empress. But underneath that, visible only to me, visible only to the daughter who had once been held through a fever and sung to in a dead language, my mother was looking at me. My mother was looking at me the way she had looked at me when I was small and hurt and frightened, and she was asking me with her eyes the question that the Empress could not ask with her voice. "Tell me what happened," she said. "Not a report, the truth." I stepped forward. I stood in the speaker's ring, where ambassadors delivered treaties and generals reported victories and criminals confessed before dissolution. I stood in the most formal, most structured, most ritualized space in the entire empire, and I threw away every piece of court training I had ever received. I spoke in my own voice, not in court register, not in diplomatic cadence, not in the measured, calculated tones of a princess delivering testimony. In my voice, the voice of a daughter who had almost died alone on a jungle floor in the dark. I told my mother about the fear, the specific, physical, unbearable fear of lying in a wrecked pod and listening to Kalari boots in the undergrowth, and knowing that no one was coming. I told her about crawling through bioluminescent moss with 2 broken arms, leaving a trail of blood that would lead straight to me, heading toward a sound I did not understand, because it was the only thing in the darkness that was not trying to kill me. I told her about a man who was humming to himself while he fixed a coolant line, a man who saw a bleeding alien on the ground and did not ask who she was, or what it would cost, or what the political implications might be. A man who picked her up and carried her into his ship, and sealed the door, and flew through gunfire, and canopy, and atmosphere, and fold space, because she was hurt, and that was all the reason he needed. I told her about packing foam splints, about a cup of water held by someone who waited for you to wake up, because waiting was the decent thing to do, about 11 hours in a failing vacuum suit, because the coils needed aligning, and someone was counting on him, and when he came back inside, he could not hold his own coffee because his hands were shaking so badly, and he looked up at me while I held the cup and said thank you. I told her about the reward he did not want, about the angle I could not find, about a man who, when threatened with the possibility that the Empress herself might view the rescue as a crime, offered to leave immediately so that I would be safe, even though leaving would mean he got nothing. I told her the truth, every piece of it, and when I was done, I said the only thing left to say, the thing I had been carrying inside me since the moment he picked me up off the jungle floor, the thing that was not a political statement, or a diplomatic argument, or a calculated move in the ancient game my civilization had been playing since before the first tower grew. I said, "He saved me, Mom. Not princess, not empress, not sovereign Ithera. Mom." The court was silent, the kind of silence that has weight, that presses against you, that fills the lungs and sits heavy in the chest. 2,000 people, and not one of them moved. Ambassadors from 9 species held their breath. Military commanders who had commanded fleets in battle stood motionless. The entirety of the Zarithi imperial apparatus, the most sophisticated political machine in the known galaxy, was frozen by 6 words spoken by a girl who missed her mother. The Empress looked at Callum for a long time. Then she asked one final question. And it was not about the rescue. It was not about politics or security or the fate of empires. She asked about his daughter, the one he called from relay stations. She asked what he would have done if saving Violela had meant never seeing his own child again. And Callum's composure broke. It did not break dramatically. There was no collapse, no tears, no grand display of human emotion. It broke the way strong things break, quietly, along lines you did not know were there. His jaw tightened, his eyes went bright. His voice, when it came, was steady only because he was working very hard to make it steady. He said he had thought about that. During the chase through the atmosphere, with pulse rounds hitting the hull and the interceptors closing and the fold drive charging too slowly, he had thought about Maisie. He had thought about her drawing tucked above the pilot's seat, the spaceship that looked nothing like a spaceship, and he had decided something. He decided that if he died, at least his daughter would grow up knowing her father was the kind of man who stopped when someone needed help. He decided he would rather she had that than had him. He said this looking at the floor, because he could not look at anyone while he said it, and his voice was not steady anymore, and he did not try to make it steady, and the honesty of that unsteadiness was more powerful than any speech the court had ever heard. The Empress nodded. She understood sacrifice calculated in terms of legacy. That was a language she spoke fluently. But I could see that she also recognized something else in his answer, something beyond calculation. This man would have made the same choice if no one ever found out. If his daughter never learned what happened. If the story died with him in the atmosphere of an uncharted world. The goodness was not performative. It was not strategic. It was structural. It was part of what he was, the way crystal is part of what Zarithia is, and you could no more separate it from him than you could pull the light from a star. She returned to the throne. She climbed the steps in silence, and every step rang like a bell, and the chamber held its breath until she was seated. She announced that the court would reconvene in one cycle for formal judgment. But as she passed me, she paused. She reached out with one hand and placed it against my cheek. The touch was warm. It was gentle. It was the most private gesture in the Zarithi emotional vocabulary, a thing done between mothers and daughters in quiet rooms with no witnesses. And she did it here, in front of 2,000 courtiers and 9 species ambassadors, and the entire apparatus of the state. She did not speak. She did not need to. I had been reading my mother's touch since I was old enough to be held, and I knew what this one said as clearly as if she had spoken it aloud. I almost lost you, and I am not finished being afraid. The night before the final session, I went to find Callum. He had proper quarters now. I had insisted, and Sorviel had relented, and the sentinels who guarded his door had been given strict instructions that he was a guest, and would be treated as such. The quarters were modest by court standards, which meant they were the most luxurious room Callum had ever occupied, which meant he had moved the pillows off the absurdly large bed and was sleeping on the floor because it felt more like his bunk on the orchard wren. I found him sitting at the room's communication terminal, jabbing at interface panels he could not read, trying to find a way to connect to a human-compatible relay. He wanted to call Maisie. He had missed 2 scheduled calls, and the missed calls were eating at him in a way that the threat of dissolution apparently was not. I sat beside him and configured the terminal. Zarithi communications technology was several generations ahead of human systems, but the underlying signal architecture was compatible if you knew how to bridge the protocols. I knew. I had studied human communications infrastructure as part of my diplomatic training, one of 1,000 subjects I had learned and never expected to use, and was now grateful for beyond expression. The call connected, the screen resolved, and a small face appeared, a 7-year-old girl with brown hair and her father's eyes, and a gap where a tooth had recently departed. She was in a room that looked warm and cluttered and lived in, and behind her, I could see a woman who was presumably her mother, watching from a doorway with an expression I could not read from this distance. Callum's entire body changed. The tension left his shoulders. The wariness left his eyes. The man who had sat calmly through intelligence interrogations and stared down 40 armed sentinels and flown through ground fire without flinching became, in the span of a single heartbeat, something softer, something more. Maisie launched into a breathless account of everything that had happened since his last call. A friend at school had brought a real caterpillar to class. She had learned to write her name in cursive, but the S was hard. She had drawn a new picture, and she held it up to the screen, a drawing that was either a dragon or a horse, and Callum told her it was the best dragon horse he had ever seen, and he meant it entirely, the way he meant everything. She asked him when he was coming home. He said soon. She asked him where he was, and he glanced at me, and then he told his daughter he was visiting a friend's house, which was technically true, in the same way that calling a moon crystal palace a house was technically true. She asked who the friend was. He tilted the screen so she could see me. Maisie studied me with the frank, unself-conscious curiosity of a child. She took in the blue skin, and the 4 arms, and the bioluminescent markings, and the regeneration casts, and said, "She is pretty. Does she have a cat?" I told her I did not have a cat. She told me I should get one. She told me cats were the best. She told me her cat's name was Pudding, and Pudding could open doors, which was both impressive and inconvenient. Callum talked to his daughter for 22 minutes, and I stood in the doorway and watched, and something shifted in my chest. Not romance. I need to be clear about that, because I know how this sounds, and I know what stories like this usually become, and this is not that story. What I felt was recognition. Recognition that this man's gentleness was not a performance. It was not a strategy. It was not weakness wearing a pleasant mask. It was the same material as his courage. They were not separate qualities. In humans, it seemed, they grew from the same root. The tenderness with which he spoke to his daughter was the same tenderness with which he had built splints from packing foam, and the courage with which he had flown through gunfire was the same courage with which he lived his small, difficult, beautiful life, hauling cargo and making calls and drawing dragon's horses and refusing to walk past people who were hurt. I left before the call ended. I did not want to intrude on something that was not mine. The Empress summoned me before the final session. She sent for me privately, through a channel that bypassed the court's communication networks entirely, and when I arrived at her private chamber, I understood why. This was the room without surveillance, the room without advisors or protocol, or the 1,000 watching eyes that accompanied every other moment of her existence. This was the room where my mother existed, as something other than a sovereign, and she did not invite people here lightly. She told me what the intelligence service had uncovered. The ambush had been orchestrated by House Varenthi, a noble house within the empire itself. Lord Varenthi's faction had been engineering a succession disruption for years, working to weaken the imperial bloodline through targeted elimination of its junior members. My death was meant to look like piracy, a random tragedy, the kind of loss that weakens a ruling house through grief rather than direct confrontation. 3 military commanders had been compromised, a trade minister, and someone close to Cathara, though not Cathara herself, who had been shaken to her core when she learned how close she had come to being an unwitting instrument in her own sister's murder. The conspiracy was deep, and it was sophisticated, and it was exactly the kind of threat my mother's intelligence apparatus was designed to detect and destroy. Arrests had already been made. The machinery of imperial justice was grinding forward with its usual remorseless precision. This part was handled. This part was under control. What was not under control, what my mother had brought me to this room to discuss in private, because it was not a matter of state, but a matter of understanding, was the human. She told me that House Varenthi had calculated every variable: patrol routes, escort fleet compositions, communication windows, jump corridor traffic patterns, the probability matrices for every contingency they could model. Their planning had been meticulous. Their execution had been precise. They had accounted for every factor that a rational intelligence could account for, and they had missed only one. They had not included in their models the possibility that a random, unaffiliated, insignificant human cargo hauler would land on that planet at that moment, for no reason related to the operation, and would choose, for no reason that any Zerithi model of rational behavior could predict, to intervene. The entire conspiracy, years of planning, millions in expenditure, the careful assembly of a network of traitors and mercenaries, had been undone by a variable that no Zerithi intelligence model would ever include: irrational compassion from an unrelated party. My mother told me this disturbed her, not the conspiracy. The conspiracy was politics, and politics she understood the way she understood breathing. What disturbed her was the human. She had built her reign on a foundational assumption: that all actors are rational, that all actions are calculable, that all compassion is transactional. Her models of the galaxy, the models that had kept her empire stable and her family alive for longer than most civilizations existed, depended on this assumption the way a building depends on its foundation. The human broke her model. And if her model was wrong, if there existed a species that acted outside the framework of calculated self-interest, that intervened in the affairs of strangers not for gain, but for reasons that could not be mapped or predicted or countered, then every diplomatic, military, and intelligence assumption the Zerithi Empire operated on might be incomplete. She said the word incomplete the way another person might say the word dangerous. I told my mother that maybe incomplete was not the same as wrong. Maybe there was room in the model for something the Zerithi had stopped believing in a long time ago. Maybe the model was like a map that showed every mountain and river and city, but left out the wind, and the wind was real, whether or not the map acknowledged it, and the wind could carry you to places the map said did not exist. My mother looked at me for a long moment, and in that look, I saw something I had rarely seen in the Empress of 11 star systems: uncertainty, not weakness, not doubt in herself or her judgment, but the genuine, uncomfortable uncertainty of a brilliant mind encountering a piece of the universe that did not fit its framework, and being honest enough to admit it. The final session convened. The court filled again, 2,000 strong, and the tension in the chamber was different now. The word had spread about the Varenthi conspiracy. Factions were realigning. Alliances were dissolving and reforming in real time. The constant fluid recalculation of political position that followed any disruption to the established order. But beneath the politics, beneath the maneuvering, there was a current of genuine anticipation. because everyone in the chamber knew that the matter of the human had not been resolved, and everyone wanted to see what the Empress would do. She announced the Varenthi exposure first, the arrests, the evidence, the scope of the conspiracy. She delivered this with the clinical precision of a surgeon describing an operation that had already been completed successfully. House Varenthi was finished. The traitors were in custody. The matter was closed. Then she turned to the matter of the human. Callum stood in the speaker's ring in his patched cargo jacket, and the court looked at him, and I could feel 2,000 minds trying to calculate what was about to happen to this man who had come from nowhere and meant nothing, and had somehow become the most significant person in the room. The Empress rendered judgment, and it was not what anyone expected. She did not grant him a title. She did not give him an estate, or a diplomatic rank, or a seat on any council. She did not fold him into the Zarithi power structure, because doing so would be the most Zarithi possible response, absorbing the useful asset, converting gratitude into leverage, domesticating the outsider. She recognized that to do any of these things would be to take what made him remarkable and crush it under the weight of exactly the system he had never been part of. Instead, she repaired his ship. She had the Orchard Wren brought to the Imperial shipyards, and she had it restored, not with Zarithi technology, but with the best human-compatible components her procurement officers could source. The engines that had coughed and sputtered were rebuilt to factory specification. The hull patches were replaced with proper plating. The coolant lines that had leaked and failed and nearly killed us both were replaced with lines that would last for decades. She made his ship what it had always deserved to be, a working vessel for a working man, reliable and solid and his. She cleared his debts. Every credit he owed on the Orchard Wren, every accumulated cost of 11 years of independent hauling, erased. She did this through human financial channels, quietly, without fanfare, so that no one in his world would ask questions he did not want to answer. She established a trust in his daughter's name, managed through a neutral human financial institution, funded in perpetuity, so that Maisie would never want for education or opportunity, or the chance to become whatever she wanted to become. The trust was structured so that Callum would never have to explain where the money came from. It would simply be there, like a safety net that appeared beneath a tightrope walker who did not know they needed one. And she granted him one thing that had never been extended to a non-Zarithi in the history of the Empire: free passage through all Zarithi space, in perpetuity, no questions asked, no inspections, no customs delays. His ship's transponder was coded to the Imperial family's own frequency. Every Zarithi vessel, every patrol, every checkpoint in 11 star systems would recognize the Orchard Wren as a ship that flew under the personal protection of the throne. She explained her reasoning to the court, and her explanation was the closest thing to a philosophical statement I had ever heard my mother make in a formal session. "This man wanted nothing from us," she said. "Giving him nothing would be the insult of treating his decency as ordinary. Giving him too much would be the insult of treating his decency as a service rendered. I give him what he needed: his ship, his livelihood, and the freedom to continue being exactly who he is. The Empire's highest honor is to recognize that a good man does not need to be made into something else. He needs to be allowed to remain what he already is." Callum did not make a speech. He was not a man who made speeches. He stood in the speaker's ring in his cargo jacket, and he nodded and said thank you. And the simplicity of those two words in the vast crystalline chamber was more powerful than any oration could have been, because it was real, and everyone in the room knew it was real. Then he asked if it would be all right to say goodbye to me before he left. I walked him to his ship. The Orchard Wren sat on the Imperial landing platform, gleaming in the light of the twin suns, and it looked like a different vessel. The same shape, the same stubborn functional ugliness, but restored now, whole, the way it must have looked when it first came off the assembly line before 11 years of hard use and deferred maintenance had worn it down. His name was still stenciled on the hull. The font had not been changed. The ship was still his. It was just better now. We stood at the base of the ramp, and the Imperial city rose around us in towers of crystal and light, and the wind carried the sound of bells from somewhere in the upper courts, and I had to say goodbye to the man who had carried me out of the dark. I told him the truth. I had spent my entire life inside a system that treated every relationship as a transaction, every kindness as currency, every connection as a thread in a web of obligation and leverage. I told him he was the first person I had ever met who made me believe that something else was possible, that a connection could exist without a cost, that someone could care about you for no reason more complicated than the fact that you were hurting, and they were there. I did not ask him to stay. I did not confess any grand emotion. I simply told him that if he ever needed anything, not as a debt, not as an obligation, but because I was his friend, and friends help each other, he should use the communication frequency I had coded into his navigation console. It was a direct line, encrypted. It would reach me anywhere in the Empire, at any time, for any reason or no reason at all. He said he would call. I said he had better. He said maybe Maisie would like to see a crystal planet someday. I said I would like that very much. I said I would show her the light gardens, where the bioluminescent flowers bloom in patterns that tell stories, and the sky bridges, where you can walk between towers and feel the wind from both suns on your face, and the deep galleries, where the first Zerithi carved their histories into the living crystal before they knew they were building an empire. He smiled, not the almost smile from the station, a real smile, tired and warm and full of something I did not have a word for in my language. He walked up the ramp. He turned at the top and raised one hand, a simple human gesture that means both hello and goodbye, and somehow means both at the same time. Then the ramp closed, and the engines fired, smooth and strong and steady, and the orchard wren lifted from the platform and climbed through the crystal city and broke through the cloud layer and was gone. I watched his ship until it reached fold space and vanished, and then I stood on the platform for a while longer, listening to the bells and feeling the wind, and being, for the first time in my life, not a princess or a diplomat or a pawn in anyone's game, but simply a person who had been helped by another person and was better for it. I went back to the throne room. It was empty now. The session concluded. The courtiers dispersed. The ambassadors returned to their residences. The chamber was vast and quiet, the crystal surfaces reflecting the late afternoon light in long amber ribbons across the floor. My mother was still there. She sat on the throne of reflected light, but she was not sitting in the posture of judgment, or the posture of authority, or any of the formal configurations. She was sitting the way a tired woman sits at the end of a long day, leaning slightly to one side, one hand resting on the armrest, looking out through the great window at the sky. I climbed the steps. Each one rang beneath my feet, and the sound was different now, softer somehow, the notes less formal, as though the chamber itself understood that what was happening here was not a matter of state. I sat on the step below the throne, the way I used to sit when I was very young, and my mother would tell me about the stars while the court slept. She asked me a question. She asked it quietly, without the projection or the resonance, or the weight of authority. She asked it as a mother asks a daughter something she genuinely wants to know. Do you think there are more of them like him? I thought about it. I owed her an honest answer, so I gave it honest thought. I thought about a species that builds ships to carry frozen protein across empty space, that names those ships after birds and orchards and small gentle things. A species that fights wars with a ferocity that terrifies the galaxy, and then builds hospitals in the ruins, and names them after the people who died. A species that produces both monsters and miracles in the same generation, sometimes in the same individual, and does not seem to find this contradictory. I thought about a man named Callum Voss who hauled cargo along routes no one else wanted, and called his daughter from relay stations, and fixed his own engine with electrical tape, and flew through gunfire for a stranger, and splinted her arms with packing foam, and waited with a cup of water for her to wake up. I thought about his hands shaking in the cold of deep space while he realigned the coils, and the steadiness of those same hands when he held his daughter's drawing and told her it was the best spaceship he had ever seen. I said, I think they are all like him. I think that is the thing about them that no one understands. They are not kind because it benefits them. They are not brave because they do not feel afraid. They are kind because they cannot look at someone in pain and do nothing. And they are brave because the doing matters more than the fear. I think every one of them carries that inside them, and I think that is why the galaxy does not know what to do with them. My mother was quiet for a long time. The twin suns moved across the sky, and the light patterns on the ceiling shifted from amber to gold to the deep rose that meant evening was coming. And we sat together in the empty throne room and watched the colors change the way we had watched them when I was small, when the empire was a concept I did not yet understand, and my mother was simply the person who held me and told me about the stars. Then she said, "Perhaps it is time we learned." I leaned my head against the step and closed my eyes and listened to the bells in the wind, and felt, for the first time since the ambush, since the jungle, since the blood and the dark, and the sound of boots in the undergrowth, something that I recognized, after a moment, as peace. Not the peace of safety, not the peace of power, the peace of knowing that somewhere out there, in the vast dark between the stars, a battered freighter with a new coat of paint was carrying a good man home to his daughter, and the galaxy was wider and stranger and more full of grace than any model had ever predicted. He saved me, Mom. He saved all of us. He just does not know it yet.